Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 67 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. Thanks for joining me again this week. In this episode, I interview Nancy Christie, who's the author of the award-winning book, Rut-Busting Book for Writers, Traveling Left of Center and Other Stories, and the Gifts of Change. Nancy's short stories and essays have appeared in numerous print and online publications, and her second short fiction collection, called Peripheral Visions and Other Stories, won a second-place award in the prestigious 2018 Royal Palm Literary Award Competition. It's scheduled for publication in 2020, and she's currently working on the book Rut-Busting Book for Authors, a companion book to Rut-Busting Book for Writers, and that's going to be released in the fall of 2019. And we talk a lot about rut busting, as well as Nancy's experience as a writer, as well as a professional copywriter for agencies, businesses, organizations, and professional writing services for writers. But before we get into that, I'm just going to give a bit of a personal update. And just before the personal update, a word about this episode's sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Find Away Voices. Find Away Voices is the premier company for getting your book out into the broadest global market for audiobooks, which includes Audible, Kobo Audiobooks, Apple Audiobooks, and many, many other players, including major library markets. Now, I recently have been using Find Away Voices, and I use them to hire a friend of mine who is an amazing narrator and professional voice talent, Scott Overton. And Scott recently finished the book this time around, or I guess I should say it's the short story. It's about a 10,000 word short story. And it was published separately as an ebook, and he just finished that, and I just approved it, and it will be pushed now to all of the audiobook markets, and I'm pretty excited about that. And I will, of course, share when that is available. Scott is doing, or has done, the short story this time around, which features my character, Michael Andrews, and I actually have a different narrator, Nick Montague, another Canadian, who is doing the full book, A Canadian Werewolf in New York. Now, that one is going to be published through ACX. I'd set that up before Find Away Voices was available, and this was just when ACX became available to us Canadians a few years ago. And Nick is back on the project, and so I am publishing that non-exclusively through ACX. I'm paying Nick for that directly. I should say I'm paying Nick through ACX for that, and it'll be published to Audible through ACX, and then it's going to be published to the rest of the markets using Find Away Voices. Again, the flexibility, and there's no one way of doing this. There's many ways, many paths. It's important for you to understand all the choices and options available for you. If you want to learn more about Find Away Voices, you can check them out at starkreflections.ca/findaway. So in terms of personal update, I was speaking about This Time Around and Michael Andrews and my Canadian Werewolf books, and I've actually been doing a bit of work on those books. So as I started to look at the audiobook projects for both Canadian Werewolf in New York, as well as the original short story that got turned into that novel, I recognized a little update that I wanted to do to the cover. So the initial cover for both This Time Around and Canadian Werewolf in New York were based on a Manhattan skyline with it's sort of twilighty, and the moon's high in the sky, and there's this beautiful orange and red and blue color to the sky, and it looked not urban fantasy enough. And I recognized that, and I was purposely not trying to do that because, again, it's about Michael as a human, not as a wolf. So the supernatural element is very subdued in this, even though it's obviously there. He does have heightened powers. But I did want to, while I was working on creating the square version of the cover from the original artwork for the audiobook, I was playing around with it, and I ghosted in a very subtle picture of a gray wolf into the sky just below the moon, which again adds that little bit of urban fantasy element to it. So, it's a contemporary thriller with some supernatural elements. So that just brings it a little bit more in line with the genre. So I did that for this time around, obviously for the audiobook cover. Then I re-released a new version of the ebook cover, as well as a new version of the full book cover for print, and I ended up pushing that through Draft Digital. Now, at the same time, and one of the reasons I'd been thinking a lot about Michael Andrews and that universe is I had actually started a couple years ago, to write the sequel to A Canadian Werewolf in New York called Fear and Longing in Los Angeles, where Michael goes to LA to be on the set of one of his books that's being turned into a film. And of course, he's longing and missing Gail, his girlfriend, who they have separated at this point, and she can't even be friends with him at this point because it's too difficult for her. So he's on his own in LA and obviously feeling longing. And again, like Canadian Werewolf in New York, the original novel, the title is a play off of a very well-known movie. And the chapters in A Canadian Werewolf in New York employ the same sort of longer title or the serious thing. So, for example, they're very, very descriptive, which I kind of use throughout the novel, and I will use throughout the novel of Fear and Longing in Los Angeles. But I had been asked to submit a story to an anthology that was an invite-only anthology, and it's it's in the Amazing Monster Tales series. So I was in the original version of that. And the next theme that they're looking for is monster road trip. So on my recent travels while I was on the plane, I made some notes in a little notepad about the potential monster road trip that Michael would take. And in this particular story, which I am calling Stowe Away, because he's heading to Stowe, Vermont, which is about a 9.5 hour train ride from New York City to or Grand Central Terminal to pretty close to Stowe, Vermont. Gail ends up going on she has to go to visit an uncle who has fallen ill suddenly, and her favorite uncle. And she has to take off in the middle of the night while Michael and Gail are still friends at this point in the storyline. And she has to take off in the middle of the night while he's a wolf, so he wakes up to get this message from her. And then he is going to try and get there. Unfortunately, he cannot fly because he let his passport expire. Again, he's still a Canadian living in New York, so there's a lot of complications there. So he's not able to fly. He never had a driver's license, so he doesn't have any ID to get on a plane. So he has to figure out how he's going to get the 9 hours to Vermont. And of course, he's not going to make it there before sunfall because he's going to turn into a wolf because it's that time of the month for him. So his challenge is getting himself on a combination of trains and vehicles to get to Stowe, Vermont. And I've been describing the story in the back of my mind as a cross between sort of planes, trains, and automobiles meets Logan. Now, Logan is the Wolverine movie, the future dystopian Wolverine movie where Logan and this young girl are on the road together. And so, of course, Michael is going to encounter a young girl on the run, and he needs to help her because that's what he does. He helps people when he sees an opportunity, and he needs to protect her, but also deal with the fact that they're both on their way to Vermont because he bumps into her on the train. And, of course, hilarity and as zaniness ensue, as is typical in the Michael Andrews sidetracks that he always gets on when he's on a route somewhere. So I'm having a lot of fun. I'm only about 1,500 words into that story, but I have until May to submit it. So I get a chance I'll get the first draft out, and then I get some reworking on it, get it to a copy editor, and then send that off to the editor for the anthology. I'm not going to do too much of an edit because these editors actually do work on the stories and edit it, which is great. And I love working with editors like that. But it's been great for me to be back in the realm of doing some creative writing in fiction again. And I love being back in the world of Michael Andrews. And I'm having a lot of fun with that. So that will probably re-inspire me to get back into finishing off the Fear and Longing novel, which is the sequel. In the meantime, it was great. It was Monday night this week. I actually received a wonderful note on my Facebook author page from a stranger who had sent me a note saying, I just finished A Canadian Werewolf in New York, and I could not put the book down. I read the whole thing in one sitting. I love it so much. I can't wait to read all your other books. I don't get that a lot. I mean, I do get positive comments and I get positive reviews as well as 1-star reviews, just like most authors. But very rarely do I hear from a stranger who said they picked it up and they could not put the book down. So that came at the perfect time for me as I was just settling in to start writing sort of one of the adventures that's going to take place about a year after the novel A Canadian Werewolf in New York, and Fear and Longing takes place about 6 or 7 months after this short story. So I'm still conceptualizing where all these different tales, because there are going to be many short stories featuring Michael and Gail in the universe, and Canadian Werewolf in New York is actually set in 2014. And this story will be set in 2015. And so again, I've been doing a lot of conceptualizing and graphing things out and looking at character sketches and stuff like that. So I'm pretty pumped about this entire project, if you can't tell. The other thing you're probably able to tell from the sound of my voice is that I have still not fully recovered from the crud I picked up when I was in Las Vegas earlier at the beginning of this month, actually. And I started to fall ill the evening of Sunday, March 3rd. I spent the entire day, March 4th, in bed with a high fever, aches and pains. I could barely stay awake, never mind move. I missed that aspect of the WMG publishing workshop. Thanks to Dean and Chris and Leah and Dale for covering for me while I was not able to be there providing information to the other writers that were there on stage. But I managed to get back on my feet for the remainder of the conference because, again, I had my second anthology to work on. And the fever eventually went away, but it moved into my chest in a cough. And even though Liz and I had an amazing 5 days, 4 nights and 5 days in Punta Cana, Dominican Republic. We went to the adult-only breathless spa because Liz is a principal of a junior school or an elementary school here in Ontario. She was wanting to get to a place where there's just no children, so that was kind of a fun spa. And interestingly enough, we bumped into even on the bus ride from the airport in Punta Cana to the resort, we bumped into a couple. And she was a teacher, as well as another woman who was there who was also a teacher, all from Ontario. We'd all actually been on the same plane. And it was kind of funny because we kept bumping into them throughout the week. And we even ended up flying back with one of the teachers as well. So we spent some time with her at the airport. And it was kind of funny because you're thinking, well, it's March break, so there's going to be a lot of families going away. And there's obviously going to be a lot of teachers trying to get away. But even though we were relaxing, I had I usually never get more than 4 or 5 hours sleep a night. I was getting a good 8 to 10 hours of sleep. I was relaxing. I was reading on the beach. I was in the sun. Despite all of that, great vitamin D and the rest that I got, I still have not been able to shake the cough. So this morning, and it is the morning of Thursday, March 21st, when I am recording this. This morning, I managed to get into my doctor. I'd made an appointment. I called in Monday and managed to get an appointment. And the doctor said, the good news is I do not have pneumonia, which is one of the things I feared, particularly with the fever that I had, like the way I'd felt when I was in Vegas. I thought I had pneumonia. Obviously, Liz and I had been starting to play squash again this week, and I've been able to be a little bit more physically active, although I was regularly out of breath. Like we were playing squash, I actually had to stop and say, hang on, give me a minute, I need to catch my breath. And my doctor did notice that my intake of oxygen is limiting right now. I do not have pneumonia, so I'm excited about that. But she did prescribe antibiotics to me. And so hopefully that will clear this up. And I'll get my voice back, because the other thing I want to do is I want to actually finish recording the audiobook myself for the 7 P's of Publishing Success, because then I need to move on to recording the audiobook for Killing It on Kobo. But that's it for the personal update for me. I had not planned on talking that long about personal update, but once you get me started, I'm really eager to share this interview with Nancy Christie for you. Now, it's interesting. Nancy actually reached out to me about a month or so, maybe a month or two ago. She had read one of my online articles that I think I published with Readsy, which was about unique opportunities for book launches in the physical world. And I talked about some of the stuff that I had done when I'd launched Haunted Hamilton, for example, and the Barnaby, my skeleton, and the different things that I do for in-person events and using that sort of author branding. And so she had asked if she could talk to me a little bit about that for a chapter in her forthcoming book. I sent her back some information, said, sure, of course, feel free to share this, and this. And then she wrote me back and said, that's way too much information. I'm not going to be able to use it all in the book, but is it okay if I write a blog post? And she has. She's written some great blog posts, which I will share in the show notes that she had shared, so you can check out another reason for you to check out her website. Of course, if you don't go to the show notes, you can just go to nancychristie.com, and that's nancychristie.com. So you can check out more about her as well as those blog posts I mentioned. But without further pre-introductory chatter, let's get on to the interview with Nancy. Hey, Nancy, thanks so much for joining me here today.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
So you are a person who inspires other writers and helps inform them. But I want to first talk about your background as a writer. How did you get into writing and publishing?
Well, the writing part, I've been writing my whole life. I mean, literally, I started in second grade. My mother had saved the first story that I ever wrote, God love her. And it's just been a very natural way for me to express myself in writing. Never really thought about being an author until I accidentally published my first book. So,
what do you mean accidentally published your first book?
Well, the first book, which is The Gifts of Change, I had never planned on being an author. Never. That was never in my mind. I was, at the time, I'd been freelancing for newspapers and that, so I was very accustomed to being the interviewer, okay. And having a byline and that type of thing, but never thought really about writing a book. Had toyed with the idea of having a short story collection come out, but never really focused on that, never really made an effort. And then my mother was diagnosed with cancer in 1999, and so to help me deal with it, because you have so many emotions and I wanted to be supportive of her, I journaled, which again, very natural thing for a writer to do.
Right.
And after about 2 years and a whole lot of journal entries, I realized they were becoming less about the whiny, scary part and more about looking for an answer, trying to figure it out. From there, because I had written essays before, it was very natural for me to start turning some of them into essays. So I did, and then, at that point, it's like, well, maybe I can get one or two of them into a magazine. And that was about as far as I thought. So I did get a couple of them published, and then by this time I had so many, that was where I first started thinking, I wonder if this could be a book.
Right.
So just kind of organized it, pitched it to a couple of agents. I mean, I knew nothing. I knew nothing, had no platform, all those things. And the response I got to the work was great, but they all said, we wish you all the best of luck, but we're not going to sign you, because it would be a loss later for them.
Right.
So took the encouragement of them saying the material was good and solid, and thought, well, I wonder if there's any publishers who publish unagented first-time authors. Those are like two big hurdles. And I sent it out to, I think, only 5 publishers, and the 5th one, which at the time, the book was first picked up by Beyond Words, and
Okay.
that's out in Oregon. She took it. Nobody was more surprised than me. And yeah, really. And that's how that book came about. It was really funny because I can remember as it was getting closer to the release date, it finally dawned on me that this very personal book, in a sense, it's not anything about my mother's
Right.
cancer. It was more about dealing with change. But there was a lot of little personal stories. It finally dawned on me that total strangers were going to read it, and I was quite frightened at that point. But yeah, it came out, and I'm like, oh, look. So I mean, everything you're not supposed to do, I did in terms
Right.
of becoming an author. And so at that point, I was just playing catch up, trying to figure out what am I supposed to do as an author, because nothing in my magazine and newspaper writing prepared me for all the marketing and the platform building that I knew nothing. Talk about being a newbie, nothing. But I
And
mean,
yet,
go ahead.
and I mean, and yet, since 2004, I mean, this book's been published in multiple foreign editions in other
Exactly.
languages as well. So it's still living and breathing out there in the world many, many years later.
Yeah, and what was funny was Beyond Words. Oh, I can't remember if it was maybe 4 or 5 years after my book came out. They did some kind of a business affiliation with Simon and Schuster, where Simon and Schuster decided to pick up some of their books and publish them under the Atria imprint.
Right.
And they told me mine was going to be one of them. And I'm like, oh, okay. I mean, fine with me. I'm not going to argue. So, yeah, I mean, that one just kind of, yeah. It's been an interesting journey, and it's still, it still sells. People still buy it. I'll still hear from readers that read it and it moved them, and just a very, very accidental path to publishing, I have to say.
And so you took that happy accident, the path to publishing, and it looks like you've converted a lot of your the things you've learned over the years into a book that you released in 2017 in the fall called Rut-Busting Book for Writers. Was that your desire to try to help other writers rather than fall into it, to maybe explore a proper path?
Yeah, I mean, that was part of it. Part of it was after the first book came out, and again, the whole idea of doing things backwards, I thought, well, how am I going to publicize this book? So I started doing rut-busting workshops, but those were more motivational, inspirational, get out of your rut type workshops. At the same time, I had been running writing classes at our local Barnes & Noble and doing some writing workshops, and thought, well, maybe I could take the rut-busting angle and use that like as a branding thing and do rut-busting workshops for writers. So I started doing those, focusing on the different kinds of ruts that writers get into. At the same time, I had some blogs going where I was interviewing writers and authors, so I would ask them questions about, what impedes your process, what slows you down. And I thought, well, this is silly, because every time I do a workshop, I had all the handouts, and people would say, do you have a book? And I'd say, no. Take the handouts, go home, follow what I tell you to do. And I thought, well, this is dumb. People are asking for something. Why don't I do it? So I decided in the spring of 2017 to write the book, wanted to bring it out in the fall. That is not a timeline I would recommend anybody else, and decided also that I would self-publish that one.
Right.
In between the first book and that book, I did have a short story collection come out. Again, another one of those kind of fell into it. Somebody was looking for a collection, and I happen to have one ready to rock. But as far as the rut-busting one, the only reason why I was able really to meet that timeline is I had so much information. All I had to do was look at my workshop, use it as a template for the chapters, go back to all the authors that I interviewed on my blogs, and it'd be like, oh, who has problems with procrastination? Let's see what she says, or let's see, what the problems are. So it was very easy because it didn't require a lot of research. And then I supplemented that with advice. I think I ended up with over 50 contributors to the book.
Oh, cool.
So,
Okay.
yeah, so it worked out really well.
Well, let's go back to procrastination because I have a huge issue with that. And so in the notes for the book, it says like how to overcome the tendency to put off till tomorrow, which is, the procrastinator's dilemma. What are some of the techniques or tips that you've gathered together to talk about that?
Well, the first thing I tell people is first figure out why are you procrastinating. Sometimes it is just their personality. They would procrastinate in every area. If the house was on fire, they would procrastinate about leaving it.
Right.
But sometimes it's also the particular project. If it's a book and they're thinking, oh, I want to write a book, but they never actually get started, you have to know what is really the barrier. Is it that you don't know how to write? Are you afraid of the writing process and what people will say? I mean, you really need to hone in on what specifically is slowing you down. Sometimes it's just you look at it and you say, this is such a big thing. I need to write 70,000 words. That's too many words. Break it down into little bits. Say, I'm only going to write 1,000 words this week. Make it so simple anybody can do it. And the thing I have noticed over the years with working with people who procrastinate is if you just get started. I use the analogy of being in a car. You're going to go on a trip. So you're sitting in the driveway and car's already packed and you're ready to go. You just can't seem to turn that key, And so it's like, okay, turn the key. Great, the car's running. Back it up a little bit. Oh, look, you've gone 5 feet. I mean, it becomes a self-generating thing. Every little step you take motivates you to take the next one. So, but you really need to know what is slowing you down.
Okay, that is cool, and that sort of relates to common writing ruts that writers find themselves in. What are some of those ruts?
Some of the ruts are they start editing. I mean, they'll write 3 paragraphs and go back and edit the first one.
Okay.
And it's like that is such a huge mistake because you of course you have to edit. I mean, there's no way around it. But don't edit while you're trying to write because not only does that slow down the flow, when you're editing, what's the editing process about? Finding mistakes. If you start too early to start picking the paragraph apart and finding mistakes, you're going to start saying, I'm a terrible writer. This is so bad. How could I have written something so stupid? Now, what good is that going to do you? That is totally going to shoot any level of confidence that you have. So go all the way through the chapter, go all the way through the entire book if you can, then start the editing process. That's a really big one is second, because you're second guessing yourself and you can't do that. I mean, by definition, the first draft is just a draft. It's not intended to be the finished product.
Okay, that is cool. And then there are roadblocks as well that you talk about. Writers set up for themselves, I think.
Exactly. I mean, one big roadblock is they'll say things like, well, guilt is a big thing. They'll say, oh, I really shouldn't devote so many hours to working on the project because after all, my family needs me. I have this to do, I have that to do, and I don't know if it'll ever get published. Even if this gets published, I don't know if it'll ever make me any money, so it would be really selfish. I mean, that's a huge thing. And I tell people, if you love writing, if it's important to you, remember you're the only person who can write that particular thing. And if you've been given the gift to write, you owe it to the world to pursue that gift. This isn't about making making pots and pots of money. I mean, of course we would all like to do that, but that's not the real issue. The real issue is putting something out there in the world that might make a difference in somebody else's life, might connect with somebody else. So that's the guilt can be a big thing. And of course, not being reasonable in terms of how much time can you really allocate. You might only be able to squeeze an hour a day because of everything else. Okay, fine. Take what you can. If it's only an hour a day, then that's what you give it, is an hour a day.
Okay, and that almost sounds like you talk in the book about the writing roadmap. Is it related to that? Like how you can turn the desire to write into actually getting it done?
Well, the writing roadmap, I think, was more of how to structure it, because some people are plotters, some people are pantsers, some people
Right.
can't keep things organized. But in general, if you're going to complete anything, and it doesn't have to be a book, it can be a short story, it can be a poem, but it is the biggest thing is consistency. Consistency in terms of devoting the time to writing, because and it kind of goes back to the whole procrastination thing. If you keep saying, well, I'll do it next week, I'll do it when the kids are on vacation, I'll do it when I retire, okay, nothing's ever going to get done. So it is forming the writing habit. Again, if you can only give it an hour a day, fine, but make sure you give it that hour a day. I have this technique I teach people. It's called 30 and 30. For 30 days, you spend 30 minutes a day writing, not researching, but actual writing, okay? The reason why I pick 30 minutes is because that's a relatively short period of time. I mean, can find 30 minutes. We can use 30 minutes on a lunch break, okay? So and you have to do it for 30 days straight. You can't say, well, it's the weekend, or well, this or that. It has to be exactly 30 days in a row. And
Okay.
it doesn't matter what you work on. Every day you might start a new writing project. The idea is you're forming the habit of every day for 30 minutes you will sit down and write. At the end of those 30 days, you are bound to have at least one thing that you want to continue on with. And that sometimes is just enough to get you over the hurdle, get you into the habit. So, and I mean, it's like anything else. It's a habit. And, if you work for a living, you have formed the habit of showing up in your office whenever you are supposed to. So it's the same thing with writing. The difference is that we're creating the habit.
Oh, that is really, really cool. Now, speaking of habit, does that have to do with where a person writes, or what they set up for that?
It can. It's very important. I personally think it's very important to have a writing space. All right. Because first of all, when you create a writing space, you are also saying your writing matters. It matters enough to have a space. Now, granted, depending on the setup, where you live, how many people are in your house, how big your place is, your writing space may be only there during your writing time. Say it's at the dining room table. Then at the end of that, you close the laptop and presto, back to being a dining room table. But the idea is you create a space, because that's giving the writing importance. And when you're in that space, that's the only thing you should be doing, is writing. One of the tips I got for those people who are not able to work in their home, so they have to go to a coffee shop or whatever to do their writing, is take like a little placemat. And when you go into the Barnes and Noble or the area coffee shop, put that little placemat right in that little table you're working on, and that becomes your writing desk.
Oh,
That
cool. Okay.
that keeps you focused. It keeps you from picking up all the magazines that are floating around or chatting with somebody. It is a visual reminder. This is my desk. Doesn't matter that there's umpteen people around me. This is my desk, and I am here to write. So, it's claiming the space and using the space.
Oh,
And
that's
and that
cool. Yeah,
yeah,
and you bring it with you, so it's very purposeful in the way that you approach it, right?
exactly.
And you talk about writers' toolbox as well.
Oh yeah. I love this. And I'm always looking for new items to put into the toolbox, because I bring the toolbox to a lot of the workshops that I do. a writing toolbox is nothing more than a collection of things that will help stimulate the writing process. This can be, and it doesn't even have to do with the project you're working on. It's more the warm-up part of the writing time. So it can be anything from writing prompts, either ones that you've collected that you have in a document, or you can sign up for any one of those websites that'll send you a writing prompt every day. It can be physical items. I'm real big on physical items because so much of the writing takes place in our head
Right.
that we need to have physical items. So for instance, I have a collection of keys, very oddball keys, not just your normal, door keys. And when I do writing workshops, I take the whole bag of keys. Everybody picks a key out, and they have maybe 10 or 15 minutes. Write something about that key. What does it make you think about? I mean, and people have come up with some really cool story beginnings or pieces of poetry, all inspired by the key. You can do the same thing with postcards. All those photographs, when we used to take actual pictures with an actual camera and have an actual photograph, just collect them and then randomly pick one out and look at it and say, oh, let me write 15 minutes on this. So the whole idea of a writer's toolbox is if you are having trouble getting started, getting in the mood of writing, you take maybe 10 or 15 minutes, use one of the tools in your toolbox, and just write on that. Just write on whatever the item is, and then can kind of get everything warmed up. And then at the end of that time period, it's like, okay, that was my little writing warm up for the day. Now let me dive into the process. It's just getting the inspiration flowing.
Is there is it actually a physical toolbox that you have the keys and
Yeah,
photographs and things like
I
that?
have this little plastic box that I can take with me anywhere, and as I keep adding to it, it's going to have to get bigger. But yeah, I mean, it's just a fun thing because we are mentally so involved in writing, I find it very useful to have a physical object, just as a different, more of a tactile kind of inspiration. You can also do it with colored pencils. I mean, I tend to write everything on the computer because I hate to transcribe. But if you want to use your little writing prompt time, and do it manually, then use colored pencils because depending on the color you pick, that might influence the tone of the piece that you're writing on.
Right. Okay, that's kind of cool. I like that. Now, speaking of physical, real world things, because we spend so much time in our heads, like you said, why is the community and connections? How is that important for a writer?
Oh, it is so important because writing is so solitary. We tend to be so judgmental about our own work, so that can really affect our ability to produce. So if you belong to a writing group, and it can be a little writing group, I belong to one that we only have like 10 consistent members. People come in, people leave. But if you belong to a writing group, for one thing, it gives you an opportunity to just mix with other people who understand why you're doing what you're doing, because people outside of the writing field sometimes look at us and wonder why we're doing this. But and a writing group can give you feedback on what you're working on. Honest feedback, but kind feedback. You never want to belong to a group that tells you you're a terrible writer.
Right. Yeah.
But you do want a group that said that paragraph is too confusing. You want concrete criticism, not personal rejection. We do enough of that ourselves.
Of course. So this is a book that has helped a lot of writers already, but you found that there was yet more that was needed because you have a book that's coming out later this year in 2019 called the Rut-Busting book for authors.
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference between the previous book and the one that you're working on right now?
Well, what I have found through my own experience and through a lot of the authors that I have interviewed is there are some specific things, issues about being an author that you may not be aware of if you are a writer. Certainly, I ran into them when the first book came out, and I realized there was a whole bunch of marketing things that I should have been doing. And of course, at that time, people weren't doing that much self-publishing, but now with that being so much more prevalent, there are also things to know about that. When people would buy the Rut-Busting book for writers, they would say, oh, this looks like it'll really help me with the writing, but I also need a book to tell me more about being an author, about the marketing, about how to pick an editor, the whole 9 yards. So I thought, okay, this is what people are asking for. And certainly I always am looking for more information. So I took the same basic format that I used in Rut-Busting Book for Writers, which is go to the experts, because my experience alone is certainly not going to be adequate to tell anybody what to do, and let me find out everything I can. So the book is loosely divided into 3 sections. The first section covers the process. That's the writing process. Everything from creating a writing schedule to dealing with procrastination to how to find the right people to edit the book and how to do your revisions. The next section is on the publishing aspect of it. Deciding, do I want to self-publish? Do I want a traditional publish? What's the difference? Query letter tips, everything that would fall underneath, I shouldn't say everything, but the key aspects that would fall under the publishing. And the third part is about book promotion, which starts when you're writing the book. You don't start your promotion efforts after the book's out, because that's too late already.
Right.
So just all the different ways that you can promote that book, and more importantly, build the platform for yourself. So, and it's an ongoing struggle, I won't deny it, because that's an entirely different amount of time you have to devote. And it's always a battle. I haven't found an author yet who says, I just love the promotion process. I just love doing all that marketing. I mean, it's exhausting a lot of times. So I try to get as much information from all the experts out there. What are some good techniques? What can you do by yourself? When should you reach out to a publicist or whatever? And just kind of give them a more or less a roadmap to follow, some ideas to consider. And I always have a nice resources section in the back of the book, because there are books that specifically focus on writing a query letter. There are books specifically focused on doing blogging, or the ins and outs, the specific ins and outs of publishing your own manuscript. There's no way I could go into all the details. So it's like, okay, let me give you some places to go, some books to read, some websites to look at. And, that way you can dive deeper into the subjects.
Oh, that's cool. So these are very much going to be companion books, right? With
Exactly.
different angles of approach,
Mm-hmm.
from creating the process of getting it done, and then getting it promoted, basically, or getting it out there and getting it into publishers' hands, or self-publishing, or whatever. I like the fact that you approach it from the point of view of giving the author the choice, so you can use this resource however you want to.
Exactly.
There's not one prescription for everyone.
Exactly, because that was one of the things in all the interviews I've done with authors that I have found out is there are so many, like talking about promotions, there are so many promotional tools out there. I mean, you could go crazy and try to do them all, but you won't be able to do them all and do them all effectively. And some of them may not fit for you. So this author said, well, this is what I did because it worked best for my book and it works best for me personally. Okay. And somebody else will have a totally different take on how to promote the book. So, I wanted to present as many different kinds of options, the in-person options, the virtual options, and then, try to figure out What can you afford in terms of time? What can you afford in terms of money? And where are you at personally in terms of being comfortable with it? Because if for instance, you're not comfortable going out and talking to people, and you're much better in the virtual medium, okay, go with where you feel most comfortable. You may eventually get to the point where you can go in person, but I like to tell people, always start from the position of power. Where do you feel most powerful, most confident? Because that's when you're going to make the best connection with whoever is in your audience.
Oh, that is fantastic. That is really, really cool.
Thank you.
So now, because you've helped so many writers and you've done the workshops and you've got these books that have helped writers, what's one thing that you wish somebody had told you when you were first starting out?
Oh, Lord. Figure out how to market yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm to this day, that is an ongoing struggle because I didn't know how to do it. I mean, back in 2004, I mean, it was all in person. I mean, I
Right.
traveled, it was all in person. It took me a long time to get into the whole internet thing. There are so many things to learn. And that, I wish I would have known what I didn't know
Right.
and let somebody take me by the hand and say, this is what you should be doing now. And oh, by the way, you've missed the boat on that one. Let's just push that one off because it's too late now to do that. But
Okay.
yeah, I wish I would have known more. I'm still learning.
We all are. We all are. Well, Nancy, thank you so much for sharing some amazing insights and excitement about your existing books as well as forthcoming. Um, let's let our listeners know where they can find out more about you so they can check out your books, pre-order the next one, maybe get their hands on the existing.
Well, the best place to go is just go to my website. It's www.nancychristie.com. Christie. I like to make life simple. There's a books tab there that'll give you the information, the sales links on the books. There's also links to my blogs, and I have to really credit everybody who participates in my blogs for being so helpful and so giving of their time. There's just so much to learn there. So that would be probably the best place. I also, I'm on Amazon, of course, who isn't? But I would say that would be the first stop is go check it out. I've got a newsletter that comes out at least once a month. I'm trying to make it come out more often. They can sign up for the newsletter, and all the links are there. Just go check out the site.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Nancy.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed this.
Nancy offered so much great advice in this interview, but there were two things that really came to my attention, and it was related to some things I recently learned about myself and I talked about in my personal update. She talked about the importance, and again, it's because of an issue I have with procrastination, of just get started. Just get started. And she talked about the strategy of writing for 30 minutes every day for 30 days to build the habit. And that's kind of what National Novel Writing Month is about, is creating that habit. But 30 minutes a day is such a short time period. And I love the fact that she doesn't specifically say it has to be the same project every day. The fact that you're sitting down for 30 minutes a day and you're applying yourself to your writing. And I thought that was an important thing to do because earlier this week, after a couple years of having put the Canadian Werewolf in New York project on the back burner, maybe because I was working on the audiobooks or whatever it was, but I had been inspired to sit down and to start writing. And there were only 3 days this week, admittedly, and in the last 4 days that I've actually done the writing, but I spent at least 30 minutes, if not more, writing. And it felt so amazing. So again, the importance of butt in chair and fingers on keyboard. Even if you're not sure what the project is that you're working on, you're just dedicated to getting some things written. I even ended up writing a blog post this week, and I hadn't updated my personal blog in a long time. And I also updated my author newsletter, and I sent that out. And I usually don't do that till the very last day of the month. So keep in mind, I did it on March 20th, and normally I would have done it on March 31st. Perhaps that's because I just did it. I was sitting down and I was dedicated to writing. Think about the things that you're wanting to work on, the things that you're planning on working on. Can you find half an hour in your day to just sit down and start working on it? Doesn't matter if it's perfect. Doesn't matter if you have all the things you need. Just start writing. See what you can get done. Maybe the act of writing itself will beget more writing. Well, that's it for episode 67 of the Stark Reflections podcast. Thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for checking out this great interview with Nancy. And a special thank you to the patrons of this podcast who are supporting the podcast over on patreon.com/starkreflections. And for that, they're getting access to additional content, which includes my Stark Reflections on other podcasts, where once a month or twice a month, I will release my own reflections on podcasts that I listen to, because I do listen to a lot of podcasts every week, so I can learn more about the business and craft of writing. And that's just some of the extra perks that you get. But the perk, of course, is that you're taking the time to let me know that you care enough to support this podcast. And I greatly do appreciate all the patrons of the show. So thank you for listening to the podcast. Until I see you in episode 68 next week, here's wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.